Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining today. And thank you, Shannon. I love to see folks introduce themselves in the chat. It looks like we have a lot of different kinds of professionals in our field from all across the country, and some even joining us from abroad. So thanks so much for taking the time. My name's Dana Flightman. I'm the Senior Training and Awareness Specialist at SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And as you know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And it's a great time to reflect on and commit to strengthen our work to prevent and address sexual assault and sexual violence in all the different forms that it takes. And one intersection that is often overlooked is that intersection of sexual violence and stalking. And we know stalking is a criminal, traumatic, and dangerous victimization. It's a crime and a traumatic event in its own right, and it's one that often co-occurs with sexual violence. It could happen because they're stalking before the sexual violence. It could be a form of grooming. It could be doing research, surveillance in order to commit that violence. Our stalkers might engage in a variety of sexually violent behaviors as part of their stalking course of conduct, or sometimes the stalking happens after sexual violence as a form of ongoing intimidation. And so, we want to know when there is stalking at any point, stalking or sexual violence at any point, right, in those intersecting victimizations, because we want to be able to recognize the full scope of harm to best hold our offenders accountable and to safety plan with our victims around everything that they're experiencing. And so, I'm delighted to see you all here today. I know that you're the ones on the ground. You know how to do what you do. My hopes just by the end of this session, you'll kind of be thinking about some new tools and ideas to better recognize the intersections of stalking and sexual violence and make sure you're addressing all those victimizations in the critical work that you're doing. So SPARC is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking, which is a fancy way of saying we're here to help the helpers and y'all are the helpers. And so anyone on the criminal justice, victim services, or on the campus side of recognizing and responding to stalking, we're here for you. So we can provide training, individualized assistance if you're working on a case and want to talk through it with somebody, and we have tons of resources on our website. So our website is stalkingawareness.org, and my colleague Kendra is here today to share some specific links in the chat, but everything's available there. There we have practitioner guides, and those are broken out by discipline. So we have a section for victim services, for law enforcement, for judicial officers, for campus professionals, and so on. We have training modules. So if you or your partners do any kind of awareness education or sexual violence education, right? You're talking about consent, you're talking bystander intervention, you want to be talking stalking as well. And so we have programs on our website with slides and scripts and videos that you could just pick up and lead. We have discussion guides on all 4 seasons of the TV show You, and actually just launched a new combined guide this morning in preparation of the finale next week. Or the last finale season starting next week. And we also have tons of resources, infographics, fact sheets, again, lots of things that you can do to educate your community in a formal program or informally, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We also have victim resources. So we are not a direct service provider. So please don't send victims to SPARC for anything other than information, because we'll just have to send them back to local resources. But we do have things that you can share with victims. So for example, we have these brochures you can order from our website in English and Spanish on understanding stalking. You can put your local information here. So if you have something to hand your survivor of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, make sure you have something for your stalking survivor as well. We also have handbooks that are printable. Those are in, I think, 10 languages now, documentation logs, and lots of other information, and webinars like this one. So if after today you're like, I wish I could hear Dana talk about stalking even more, you are in luck, because we have an archive of recorded webinars, and Since we're called SPARC, I got us to call it the SPARchives. So that was like the height of my career. So you can check us out on the SPARchives anytime. We're also on social media. Our handle on there is at follow us legally. If you get our sick sense of humor at SPARC, we will not be scared. We want you to follow us. It is consensual. And sign up for our newsletter. As an anti-stalking organization, we will not contact you excessively or without your consent. So you have to actually opt in to our newsletter, and it's one we send around quarterly. It's not one of those you're getting all the time. So I really hope that you do connect with us to help keep stalking top of mind year round. All right, so if you haven't been to a previous training on stalking, unsurprisingly, I recommend it. We have recorded webinars on our website. I would start with context is key, but just a quick refresher to get us all on the same page. We want to remember that stalking is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states and US territories, including the District of Columbia. It's a crime in most tribal codes and in the military justice system. It also violates campus policy. Thanks. Sorry. And is one of the reportable crimes under the Clery Act. And so, it's a crime or policy violation pretty much across the board. And it's important to know your stalking statute. And so we have a map on our website where you can look at your jurisdiction and get all the analysis and everything you need to best understand your specific statute. And I encourage you to do so. But the good news is that it is a crime across the country. And stalking is traumatic. Many stalking victims experience both mental and physical health issues that can be short-term to lifelong, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression. And if you think about what's perhaps a little bit unique to stalking is that sense of anticipatory fear, that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And we have stalking survivors feel like that sometimes for years. In fact, the average duration of a stalking case, not the high end, the average duration is 2 years, and 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so stalking can last from one afternoon to an entire lifetime. There's a huge variety there. But for so many of our victims, they have this feeling of, when's this person coming back, always looking over their shoulder, never feeling it's truly over. That can go on for quite a long time. And you can imagine how traumatic that is, as well as the hypervigilance that often results. Many lose time from work, and quite a few relocate. This really surprised me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about it, it's expensive, it's stressful, it's not something you do because someone's kind of annoying you. We have 1 in 7 victims relocating, which I think helps to illustrate how traumatic this victimization can be. Always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's one who said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." And I like this quote because it illustrates what so many stalking survivors have said to me, that sense that it's never really over, that they can always come back, that, oh, Mother's Day is coming up, I'm going to get a creepy card in the mail, and they do. And stalking is dangerous. It often occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet, so often these stalking behaviors are dismissed as and minimized as, oh, it's just texting, it's following, it's making a sexual joke or two. It's annoying, but no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. These behaviors and tactics adding up and escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying that every stalking case escalates to the point of homicide, extreme violence, and or sexual violence, right? That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases of attempted or completed homicide, attempted or completed violence. And at that point, responders are often looking backwards and saying, oh, look, there's this whole history of stalking victimization here. Often that was reported to multiple sources, but was not handled with the urgency needed. So we don't want to do that, right? We want to identify the stalking while it's happening so we can intervene then and help prevent further trauma, violence, possibly even homicide. So what is stalking? Well, the short version depends who you ask, right? Are we talking about the behavioral definition? Are we talking about your specific statute? So again, I encourage you to look at your statute, but today I'm talking about the behavioral definition. And regardless of how broad or narrow your statute is, you still want to know that behavioral definition because whether or not stalking's the most strategic charge is an important but separate question. You also want to make sure you're identifying stalking so that you can help keep your victim safe, right? And connect them to the right resources. So, behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So, to break that down just a little bit, it's a pattern of behavior that's typically two or more behaviors. There's a few states that require three or more, but behaviorally, in most places, it's two or more behaviors. It's directed at someone specific, so it's not random. It's not someone looking in a locker room at whoever happened to be there at the time. They're targeting a specific person or people and it would cause fear. Um, and that fear is really important to understanding stalking, is that stalking is scary. Um, and so fear is tough though, right? Because fear is very personal. People are afraid of different things. And so when we think about fear, well, fear of what? And our behavioral definition includes safety or safety of others, so that bodily harm, right? As well as substantial emotional distress. Um, and emotional distress is also fear. It's just recognizing that fear may be of outcomes in place of or in addition to physical violence. And so, thinking about this in a sexual violence context, someone might be afraid of sexual assault, right? That could be the fear, the bodily harm that will come to them from sexual assault or to someone that they love. The emotional distress, you might have a victim saying, well, I don't think they would assault me. But for example, we've had cases where an offender um, was looking at, had hacked into the email and so was watching every email that this victim sent, and this victim was applying to jobs. So he'd also created some fake nude images of her and wrote a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually. Every time she applied for a new job, he would follow up with that to that HR department by sending these photos and these sexual rumors. And then he'd go on LinkedIn, find all the potential colleagues and do the same. And so that's not like, oh, it sounds like you're having a stressful day, right? That's emotional distress in that this person cannot live a normal life. They're being approached in a sexual way and don't know why. They can't provide for their family. They can't get a job. Um, and so, that kind of fear of sexual humiliation as well is often part of a stalking case or a fear that you'll release intimate images, whether real or fabricated, etc. And so I bring up that emotional distress because I think, and some statutes are more specific to bodily harm, but of course, sexual violence, there's a bodily harm piece, and there's, of course, a mental and psychological and emotional harm as well. And the fear of that piece of it, whether there is the physical or not, is also important and can be part of a stalking case. Um, People experiencing emotional distress often feel that they are under surveillance, that their life is being invaded, that they're being sabotaged, that they're being threatened. The best quote that I saw about it was a victim who said, it's like he's taken my life without killing me. So that sense of I cannot live a normal life because of the interference from the stalker. But we need to know the context to understand the fear because many stalking behaviors are quite contextual in nature and may not look like much at a glance. For example, there is a case where an offender sexually assaulted the victim using an object and then kept mailing the victim that object. And so when the victim would, you know, open her door and look on her porch and open a package and it was this object again and again, that was really scary and it was intimidating and it was really a message from that offender saying, hey, remember this, right, to enhance the trauma of the response and to intimidate her out of reporting or moving forward and to somewhat imply that they could do it again. But if you just got a package with a random object in it, you might be curious but not necessarily scared, right, if you didn't have that specific um, association with it. It's all about the context. And so what you want to do is when you're talking to victims, try to understand that context better, right? If they're upset or scared and you just can't really see why, realize something may be scary to them, but not to you as the responder. And so what you want to do is ask questions like, what message did that send to you? What's the story behind that? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic, albeit an extreme example, is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? So the victim gets flowers, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, that's so thoughtful because they don't know about that meeting. And so it's context that makes stalking scary, and it's context that makes stalking stalking because generally no one event is stalking. It has to be, let's zoom out. What are all the behaviors going on here? How are they adding up into a course of conduct? Um, and it can criminalize otherwise non-criminal behavior. It's not generally a crime to send somebody flowers, but it is generally a crime to make a credible threat to kill somebody. So when one means the other, we have to do some digging and explaining to make, because that's how our stalkers are getting away with their behaviors. You have responders saying, well, flowers aren't threats. Well, yeah, not always, but they can be. It all depends on the context, and why that is causing fear. So again, that fear is really important. And fear of sexual assault is uncovered under most, if not arguably all, stalking statutes. Some of your statutes actually specify like contact sexual violence, or they have other more specific terms. Most do not. But what this means is if someone's afraid of sexual assault, that could be a stalking case as well. If there's a pattern of behavior leading them to be afraid that they will be assaulted, that itself is a crime generally, right? And that might be a stalking case. I also bring up fear. Fear can be of a variety of different things. It could, of course, be of the actual sexual assault, but it could be of these other crimes and or victimizations as well. It might be that fear that they will be watched, their privacy will be invaded, that someone else will be harmed sexually. It could be that an intimate photo is created or shared without their consent. It could be that they're sharing personal sexual information or spreading rumors, right? All of these things are scary, and the fear of sexual assault or these other kinds of sexual violence can all be part of a stalking case. So one reason I bring up fear is because fear is what separates stalking from a victimization it's often confused with, which is harassment. And these behaviors can intersect and overlap. Different statutes have different requirements, so harassment's also quite serious, and I'm certainly not trying to minimize it in any way. But generally, harassment is that repeated conduct that would make someone feel um, offended, create a hostile environment. They're frustrated, they're being disrespected, it's demeaning, right? They're not necessarily afraid of sexual violence. At the point when someone is afraid of sexual violence, I would argue that might actually be a stalking case. And so I just invite you to look at, when you're addressing sexual harassment or you're working with organizations who are, I think it's worth kind of positing, well, at what point does this cross the line from harassment to stalking, which typically is a higher charge, and our victims of stalking are typically at higher risk of violence than our harassment victims. So we want to call it what it is there, because I see this misused quite a bit, and it gets kind of put down to harassment when actually this is stalking. So I think it's worth thinking about there. So, stalking and sexual assault actually, as victimizations, have quite a lot in common. And I think it's nice to start there because folks tend to be a little bit more familiar with sexual violence than stalking. Um, One is this myth of the stranger offender. So if you look for images of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay, this is the kind of stuff I get. And it's very similar to that myth of the stranger rapist. In fact, some of the locations here, right? You literally see dark alleyways, parking lots, this idea that the offender is someone who comes out of the darkness, some anonymous stranger who's kind of lurking and following. And we see this often, call me when you get home because someone could come out of the shadows and assault you. And that can happen and does happen, but it's by far the minority of cases. And that's true for our stalking cases as well as our sexual assault cases. The reality is that usually the offender is somebody that we know, often an intimate partner or ex-partner, or an acquaintance. But the same kind of mythology is a problem for both of these crimes and has some real impacts because we know that victims rely on what seems like a real crime when they decide to report. And so if you look at like the images on the slide, I mean between these two, who looks like a stalker? I'm going to go with Mr. Trenchcoat, right? Looks a little more suspicious, but we know that our intimate partner stalkers are more prevalent and on average tend to be more dangerous. Um, but people are less likely to report. And this, of course, happens with sexual violence as well. If it's a very obviously violent stranger, that is going often gets more attention, is more kind of a clear cut than what's actually mostly happening in our sexual violence cases, which are people who know each other, have built some level of trust, and then violate that trust. And so victims who knew their stalking offenders, they're more scared, perhaps because they know this. They know this person is scary and could cause real harm, but they're less likely to report to police because it doesn't seem to match that image of what a stalker is. And I can just tell you anecdotally, like I know a survivor who was stalked twice in her life, totally unrelated incidents, was just really unlucky twice. One time the offender was a homeless man in her neighborhood with mental health issues. The other time it was her ex-husband. So guess which one got a more urgent response from police? It was the homeless man, right? But when she was afraid for her life, it was when her ex-husband was stalking her. And so these misperceptions and myths actually have a real impact on reporting as well as the response to those reports when they're made. Both stalking and sexual assault are prevalent. Very similar rates here. It depends what study you look at, but if we're looking at the NISBS, about 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking, and those numbers look pretty similar for contact sexual violence. 1 in 3 women or 1 in 2 women, depending what um, measure you're looking at. And so these are both quite prevalent and quite under-resourced and under-recognized. And our victims of sexual violence and stalking experience pretty similar victim blaming. And I think this is something that we have certainly there's more room to grow in terms of stopping victim blaming for sexual violence survivors, absolutely. But I hear a little bit more about that than with stalking, even though they might be told very similar things. So both kinds of victim might be given the attitude of, well, were you clear you wanted them to stop? Aren't you kind of flattered by the attention? If you didn't want the attention, why did you communicate or dress that way or share that information or encourage them in some way, right? We get that kind of pushback on both kinds of victims. And for Stalking, especially when we're talking about stalking through technology, we often see victims blamed quite a bit for what they choose to share publicly. And at the risk of sounding a little bit twee, I think the what did you share has become the new what did you wear, right? Where there's a sense of, well, if you didn't want them to find you, why'd you share your location? The problem isn't that a victim chose to share their location on an app where that's normal in their with their friends, with their community. The problem is that an offender chose to look at that, see the location, and choose to show up to cause this person fear and harm. That is not the victim's responsibility. We can still talk about risk reduction, just like we do for sexual violence. Um, but the offender's responsible for misusing the information, the access, what have you. And so we want to be thoughtful of that when we're working with our victims as well. All right, so stalking and sexual assault specifically, just right off the bat, we have to recognize the co-occurrence. This was a survey of sexual assault survivors ages 18 to 24, and it simply asked them, have you experienced stalking as well? Almost half of them are saying yes. And so we know that these victimizations often go hand in hand. So this can happen a few different ways. One helpful thing to look at is our SLY framework, which is an acronym for surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference through sabotage or attack. So if you're familiar with SPARC resources, you know that we love this framework because it helps to expand folks thinking about stalking. Because often when people think stalking, they think surveillance. So you get that imagery of the binoculars or the camera, and that is a part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the whole picture because anything scary that's not the first thing that happened could be part of a stalking case. And a lot of there's different kinds of sexually violent behaviors in all of these categories. And so we're going to watch, I think it's a three-minute video that explains some of these intersections and how some of these behaviors might manifest.
There are 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act: domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So how do sexual assault, or sexual violence more broadly, and stalking intersect? Victims who were stalked by an abusive intimate partner were more likely to experience multiple forms of sexual violence than those abused but not stalked, including sexual degradation, substance use, and penetration while sleeping. About 1 in 3 women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. And about half of sexual assault survivors said they experienced stalking as well. Well, remember that stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others, or to suffer substantial emotional distress. So fear or emotional distress about what? Many stalking victims and survivors are afraid of sexual violence. In fact, while stalking statutes vary across the country, most include fear of sexual violence. Every category of stalking behavior, surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, and interference through sabotage or attack, can include tactics that are sexually violent in nature. Surveillance behaviors may include voyeurism, whether in person or by accessing or planting recording devices. Surveillance may also include gathering information about the victim, either through technology, asking mutual acquaintances, or other means. That information might include researching and selecting victims based on their perceived vulnerabilities, disabilities, or lack of credibility, or finding out when a chosen victim is alone or isolated to commit the sexual violence. Stalkers may also gather information for later blackmail or extortion, or the monitoring might happen after the violence to see if the victim is telling anyone about what has happened. Stalkers may also engage in life invasion, showing up in the victim's life when the victim doesn't want them to be there, through leaving sexual items or gifts, excessive contact of a sexual nature, and or spreading sexual rumors or information about a victim to others. Many stalkers intimidate their victims through both direct and indirect threats. These could be threats to share sexual images or information, engaging in symbolic sexual violence like cutting underwear or stealing intimate items, threatening to sexually harm the victim or those the victim cares about, or coercing or threatening the victim into sexual acts. Interference through sabotage or attack may include tampering with or stealing birth control, posting or sharing intimate images of the victim, spreading sexual rumors, impersonating a victim online to set them up for sexual violence, or actually committing a sexual attack. When you're working with a victim of sexual violence or intimate partner violence, be sure to ask about stalking victimization.
All right, gonna stop it there. But yes, a good recap as well as some specific examples. And for folks asking in the chat, is this available for us? Yes, it is, and that's one of the reasons I included it, is because this video is a standalone kind of mini lesson that you can use in your education efforts. So that's available on our website as well.
There are
So like we said in the video, and like I mentioned before, there's different ways that this can intersect. And so at different points in the stalker's course of conduct. And so I'm going to talk about each of these with some examples in a little bit more detail. So the stalking might happen before the sexual violence. And so sometimes that is identifying vulnerable victims and or figuring out how and when to access them to commit the assault. And so we're going to watch this short video. It's a recent news story that shows that stalking before attempted sexual violence.
Say that woman called for help using a smart home device. 5 News reporter Jose Carranza has new details now from the Washington County prosecutor.
On December 31st, Springdale police were called out to a report of a man wearing nothing but a ski mask who had broken into a home and attacked the woman inside.
He went to the woman's bedroom, he got on top of her in the bed, he was attempting to sexually assault her, he had a roll of duct tape with him.
The victim reported it happened just 10 minutes after her husband left.
The woman called out to her Amazon Alexa device and had it call 911. When she did that, the man ran out of the house and was found nearby by police.
Police say they found Mario Guereca Vasquez in his truck with a pair of women's pink underwear and a phone that had photos of the woman unaware and in her underwear taken from outside the home. Police say a home surveillance camera caught video of Vasquez when investigators showed it to him. They say he admitted to having stalked the woman for a month and eventually wanted to go inside.
There was a strange incident that happened about a week before where a pair of her undergarments was found on a piece of exercise equipment in the front yard, and she just thought it was strange that they were there because she had them in a laundry hamper. She asked her husband said he had nothing to do.
All right, so here we see stalking prior to that sexual assault. And while this news story is just capturing, a little bit of what happened here at this one moment in time, I can't help but wonder, but what if we identified the stalking earlier, right? We certainly shouldn't have to get to the point of attempted sexual violence before stalking is identified and or taken seriously. And here we have after the sexual violence, clearly this was premeditated, right? And there are other stalking behaviors happening. And so I hate to say a good example because it's bad, and so we don't like it, but a strong example of that intersection as well as that stalking in advance of sexual violence, especially when you think about, the offender showed up 10 minutes after her husband left. And so to me, that implies he was watching the home. He was looking for an opportunity to commit the assault. So he had chosen a victim very intentionally, and then was also kind of doing that surveillance and research to see when he could access her. And so we do see that stalking in that premeditation.
Say that.
Stalking for sexual violence can look scary, right, on its face. Like most people would say, oh, a stranger taking pictures through a window, wearing a ski mask, all of that is very like horror movie, right? But stalking for sexual violence can also look more like this kind of grooming behavior. And so, of course, there's different kinds of sexually violent offenders. But there are those repeat rapists that have a specific MO. And typically this is what they do. They're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. That might be our upperclassmen looking for freshman women without a lot of drinking or partying experience who seem naive. That might be our child sexual predator, looking for a child who doesn't seem to get a lot of attention at home or is vulnerable in some other way. They're going to establish a relationship and build trust. You seem really mature for your age. I understand you so much better than your parents do. If they haven't yet, they're going to meet in person and isolate the victim. So that could be come to this party, plying that victim with alcohol and separating them to a different room to commit sexual assault. That could be come to the basement, we'll take some pictures, coerce them into sexual acts, and then contact them after, either to say thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two. So if you think about that under the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yes, it includes multiple contacts. Is it directed at a specific person? Yes, it is, because they're choosing their victims often based on their perceived vulnerability and lack of credibility. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Well, yeah, sexual violence is scary. We're afraid of sexual violence. But you might be thinking, but when though? Because on day one, your victim might say, well, I wasn't scared when they told me I was mature for my age. Like, that was flattering. That seemed awesome, right? But there's no statute that says when fear has to attach. So if your victim's saying, yeah, I thought it was a compliment at the time, but now that I look back and realize the entire relationship was a setup for my rape and it all started with that text message, that could still be a stalking case. And still, those later events can reshape how we look at earlier events when we're thinking about that pattern of behavior. Um, and so sometimes in our sexual assault cases, it comes down to this moment of consent or non-consent. And I encourage you to also look for that grooming behavior, because you might have an offender say, no, we had this great relationship. Look at all these contacts. And then maybe consider, could there be some accountability for stalking there? I'm not saying that'll always work, but it's something to consider. This is a recent study essentially showing that this has moved online. I'm sure not surprising anyone here. This is a small study, but one that I thought was really striking. 14% of the rapes on this college campus were in initial meetup arranged through a dating app. And what was especially striking about this is that it's a high percentage of victims with self-reported mental illness. And these are more violent sexual assaults um, than typical, more strangulation, more injuries. And so, long story short, I think the researcher summarized it really well in this quote here at the bottom. Sexual predators are using dating apps as hunting grounds for vulnerable victims, right? They're engaging in that grooming behavior. Who seems vulnerable? Who maybe won't be believed because they have a mental illness? And then identifying those people, grooming them, committing the assault. It's sexual violence and it's stalking, whether that happens in person, through technology, or a combination of both. Intimate image solicitation and exploitation. And so this is often part of a stalking case, and there's a lot of great resources on this. Sometimes it's called non-consensual image distribution. Not like there's just a lot of different acronyms for it. But what I'm talking about is that creating and or accessing and sharing sexual or intimate images. And so this is common. This was a study a few years ago. I would probably the numbers are higher now, but about 16% of our 18 to 24-year-old victims are reporting that the stalker shared nude, semi-nude, or sexually explicit photos or videos of them. This is also sometimes called revenge porn. We don't love to call it that because it's not really about revenge. It's not really porn. But I understand non-consensual distribution of intimate images is a lot to say, and so I understand. But that's what we're talking about here, and it's increasingly prevalent and easy to share. And it doesn't matter if the image was at one time taken consensually, if it was taken under a power and control dynamic, or if it was fabricated entirely. The crime is in sharing these without somebody's consent, and the kind of harm that can do to their safety and reputation. And so sometimes the stalking is for leverage. They're stalking to get that non-consensual photo or recording, right? That could be through grooming behavior. Hey, send me these pictures, and then later weaponizing those pictures. It could be like in that previous case example where someone's literally taking photos of someone in their underwear through a window, right? They're taking photos that are intimate without that consent. Or it might be gathering information for later sextortion. So that kind of blackmail, if you don't X, Y, like we need to have sex or I will release this information, right? And that can also be part of a stalking case where they're doing that kind of surveillance and research to gain that leverage. And so, for example, this was another fairly recent story. Um, this offender had two ex-girlfriends, and so what he did was he spread sexually explicit images of them on their lawns. So he did this at one victim's home multiple times, just printed a bunch of photos and then just spread them where her neighbors could see them. He also created a fake Instagram account pretending it was one of the victims, and we see this impersonation quite a bit. And then he would do that to share intimate images and videos with strangers through the app, so pretending to be her. And then you see this leverage piece as well, right? Where because this is happening, one of the victims finds out, she meets with him to try to make amends, like, hey, can we stop doing this, right? What can I do? And he pulls a gun on her. And so it's sexual violence, it's stalking, and here now it's, assault, right? Because it's a way to get somebody to meet with him, and we know our stalkers are trying to get close to their victims, and so they might be using these sexually violent tactics in order to coerce them into doing that and to cause even more physical and or sexual harm. Now, unfortunately, it's become increasingly easy to generate intimate images that are not real in the first place. And again, it doesn't matter why the photo or video exists, but I often see a lot of victim blaming around this, where there's a sense of, well, if you don't want these videos out there, don't create them, which is not very constructive. And we have to recognize this is a common part of dating culture. And the problem is sharing them, not creating them. All that. So with all that being said, no one is safe from this, because even if you've never taken an intimate photo, it's quite easy for someone to do this with any photo or video of a victim. These kinds of things have been around a long time, and it's only getting easier, less expensive, or free. And even if the video is not real, the harm is real, right? And so these are increasingly out there, and there's very little control around how these images are used or shared and the kind of harm they can do. There's a lot of great resources around this issue. And so, I'm happy to share the slides, and these are on our website as well. But to help get these taken down, of course, once something's on the internet, it's hard to get it taken off the internet. But there are some great services, as well as an image abuse helpline through the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. So I hope you'll pass those on to victims, of course, whether it's part of a stalking case or not. But I think while this issue is getting more attention, which is wonderful, it's not always put in the context of stalking. And it may not always be a stalking case, but I think if a offender threatens to share the image, shares the image, and then brags about it, that's three behaviors, not just one. And I'd argue that that image distribution was part of a stalking course of conduct. Or if they engage in intimidation to get the photo in the first place and then shared it, right? You see what I'm saying? Like this is actually a pattern of behavior. It's not a one-off event, and we'd like to have accountability for that as well. We also see offenders soliciting third-party sexual violence. And so that came up a little bit in that previous news story that I just shared, where they're impersonating a victim online. And we see that increasingly, and this was a fairly well-known case where that happened to extreme effect. And so we're going to watch this quick clip here.
Matthew Herrick says for months he couldn't go to the restaurant where he waited tables or his home without men he didn't know approaching him for sex or drugs. Attorneys Carrie Goldberg and Tor Eklund are representing the Manhattan resident in a lawsuit against Grindr, the gay dating app.
This was a life or death matter. They would follow him into the bathroom at work. They wouldn't take no for an answer.
Herrick says his ex created impersonating profiles of him and arranged sex dates with more than 1,400 men. The actor didn't want to speak publicly today,
But I don't have any comment right now.
but he alleges he alerted Grindr to the problem.
All they ever did was send back an auto reply. Thank you for your complaint.
Right. So this is a really fascinating case and an important one, but illustrates for, for my purposes here, that exact thing, that impersonating a victim, and then through that impersonation, actually soliciting sexual acts and or sexual violence. And this often goes with that surveillance around location. And so you might have an offender watching a victim, and then pretending to be them, saying, hey, I'm wearing that red sweater, I'm at this coffee shop. They're approached by a stranger saying, I'm here for what we talked about. The victim's like, I'm not even on that app. What are you saying? And really all someone needs to make a profile is a photo of the victim and an email address. And so it's quite easy to do. And so we do increasingly see that sexual violence from third parties or attempted sexual violence, anywhere from ruining reputation, right? And that just being scary and upsetting and degrading, all the way up to actual sexual harm when people are showing up in person. And that's often part of a stalking case. The stalking can also happen after sexual violence, for that continued intimidation. And so it might look something like this, after the sexually violent encounter. It could be that, hey, thanks for a great time. Hey, I wouldn't want to have to show anyone these pics, right? So that kind of control, blackmail. Wait, did you tell them? Answer me, especially if they're engaging in that surveillance after. And so because there's a lot of, and again, this can intimidate somebody from seeking help. This can reinforce the trauma of the assault, like in sending that object in the previous example I mentioned. So sometimes it's that after sexual violence. We've also had offenders impersonate sources of help or comfort. So impersonate, say, a trusted friend online, and then try to talk the victim out of reporting formally. Or tampering with their ability to do that, impersonating law enforcement, for example. And so we do see that continued intimidation after. And so because there's a lot of sexually violent behaviors that are also stalking, what we often say is, if you can't charge stalking, charge something. And so it of course depends on your code, but look at all of these as individual crimes as well as part of a bigger course of conduct, right? If they have indecent exposure on day one and voyeurism on day two, I know I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you have a stalking case. You have two or more behaviors that would cause fear. If we didn't do anything with that indecent exposure, now we don't have a stalking case because we're starting with one instead of two. And so we want to be combining the whole course of conduct with every potentially criminal act, sexual and non-sexual, in person and through technology, but also thinking about, maximizing accountability and what are some of the crimes that might be committed in that course of conduct. And most of our research on stalking and data comes from the intimate partner violence field. And that's not wrong, it's just incomplete because about 30 to 40% of our stalkers are current or former intimate partners. So about 60 to 70% are not current or former intimate partners. They're acquaintances, they can be strangers, though it's relatively rare. They might be brief encounters, like, oh, I met that person at a coffee shop once, or I think they went to my friend's party. Family members or persons of authority, like a supervisor, an academic advisor. And so, intimate partner stalking is not all stalking, in other words, but it is a big piece of it, that extension of power and control, right? And that is where most of our research comes from. And so here I want to focus on that intersection specifically within that segment of our intimate partner stalkers and how that intersects with sexual violence. And so often in our field, if I hear folks talk about stalking at all, they'll often say something like, okay, it was an abusive relationship. So I'll go back to that. It was an abusive relationship, and the day the victim left, that abuser began stalking them. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, our abuser is following them, showing up at work, showing up at school, putting a tracker on the car, threatening them, breaking their things, reading through their emails, reading their messages, demanding passwords, that's stalking, right? It's intimate partner violence. It's what we might call emotional abuse or digital abuse or coercive control. And it's stalking. It's both. And it can happen during and or after a relationship. Over half the time, it's happening during the relationship as well. But folks often don't call it stalking then. They call it, again, emotional abuse, digital abuse. And it is those things, but we want to call it stalking as well, because our intimate partner stalkers, on average, tend to be our most dangerous stalkers. And because our intimate partner stalkers, when we're thinking about sexual violence, are more likely to be sexually violent than intimate partner abusers who don't stalk. So, about a third of women stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted by that partner. Um, and women who were stalked by a violent partner after obtaining a protective order were over 9 times more likely to be assaulted than those who were not stalked. So, in other words, all of these women have been abused, all of them have protective orders. For the women who continued to be stalked after that abuse and protective order, 9 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. So, what this is telling us is that our intimate partners who stalk are more likely to commit sexual assault, right? And it's not only sexual assault itself, it's other forms of sexual violence as well. So, this is that same study. All these women have protective orders, all of them been abused, some were abused and stalked. For the women abused and stalked, they have higher rates of all the harms listed here. Everything from implicit threats and force, which doubles, to sexual degradation, sexual coercion. And so all of these are much higher, as well as force, which is not on here, forced substance use, also higher during sex. And so stalking is an indicator not only of sexual assault, but multiple forms of sexual violence. And so, long story short, too late maybe, ask about co-occurring victimizations. Absolutely ask your stalking survivor about intimate partner and sexual violence. But because there are so few resources for stalking, there is no stalking hotline. There's no standalone stalking crisis center. And so I know that a lot of the folks you're working with might be primarily presenting as survivors of intimate partner violence and or sexual assault. Make sure you're asking them about stalking victimization, because too often that's missed, and then we're not recognizing the full scope of harm and able to plan appropriately. Stalking can also intersect with sex trafficking in ways that are, I think, similar to what we've talked about, but worth mentioning as well. If we think back to that surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference, SLY framework, if someone, again, they're grooming, they're targeting somebody, they might be gathering information in order to sexually exploit them or blackmail them. They're asking individuals to monitor the behavior on their behalf, right? So there's definitely that surveillance as a kind of control. It could be that life invasion. They are requiring check-ins. They're showing up. Could also be leaving gifts or small indulgences, right? To say, hey, good job today, or to kind of keep reeling them back in, right? So there's those reminders, here I am, as well as that constant contact, that where are you? You're supposed to be here. I heard you were there last night, like those kinds of constant contacts. Interference, of course, it could be the actual sexual violence, could be sharing now sexual photos or videos with others. And intimidation, maybe it's violence against somebody else in the operation, right? As kind of a threat. And we know so many victims say, in all of these situations, hey, when it was just me, it was fine. But now that I'm worried about other people being harmed, that's really not okay. Um, and so for various kinds of sexual violence, including trafficking, we see those stalking strategies as well. And so we want to be sure that we're naming stalking wherever it shows up in our intimate partner, non-intimate partner relationships, whether it's happening before, during, or after the sexual violence, for a few reasons. And you might be like, well, you're the stalking lady, like, of course you care that I call it stalking, but does it really matter? And unsurprisingly, I will argue it does for these reasons, some of which I already mentioned at least briefly. One of your charging and prosecution options. So I understand stalking is not always the most strategic charge, right? It'll depend on your code, it depends on the circumstances, but it's very undercharged and it's not never the most strategic charge either. Most prosecutors like having a menu of options, and it can also be quite compelling and powerful in the right case. And people love it when they get it. So let me explain why. So if you're prosecuting a case of, say, domestic assault, I'm generalizing, but the court's going to try to limit you to that evening. Did violence take place that evening? Yes or no? But if you're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is. This is not someone with an anger management issue who snapped one day. This is someone who's been reading all the email and going on LinkedIn and photoshopping nude images and methodically emailing them to hundreds of people. This is someone who's been, showing up, sending creepy objects, tampering with birth control, making sexual threats, right? And all of this is relevant because it's part of the stalking course of conduct, and stalking's the crime. And so all those elements can be relevant here. So, that can paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender is and explain more beyond that incident of physical harm. Also, for safety planning, when you see stalking, you want to be thinking increased risk of homicide as well as physical assault and sexual violence. Um, if and our intimate partner stalkers on average are the most threatening and the most violent, but all stalkers can be dangerous. So when you see stalking in, say, an intimate partner violence situation, that should be a red flag. This stalker, I'm sorry, this abuser is more likely to engage in a variety of sexual harms as well, from sexual assault as well as degradation, um, image distribution, etc. And so if we just call it emotional abuse, we miss that. We miss that increased likelihood of physical and sexual harm. And so when we see stalking, we want to be thinking, okay, surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference. What is the full scope of conduct here? How can I help keep this victim safe? And using those tools. There's also a stalking specific risk assessment called SHARP, the Stalking and Harassment Assessment and Risk Profile. And so that's a really great tool to assess risk specifically in stalking cases that can help with your safety planning as well. And thanks, Kendra's putting that in the chat. Again, none of this really gets activated unless we're thinking, is this a stalking case, right? And so we want to have that lens on so that we safety plan appropriately and with a level of urgency that is needed here. We also want to be thinking in safety planning about access and information because these cases are dynamic. Stalking cases, like I said earlier, can last a long time. And so, no, we can't read the future, but just because our offender hasn't, say, shown up at the victim's home yet, doesn't mean they won't. Do they have access? Do they know where it is? And so let's make sure that they have a safe place to go and a bag packed. And maybe we want to install a camera so we can catch the offender doing that, right? And so thinking ahead as much as possible when we're thinking about stalking versus reacting to a single incident. And victim empowerment. Even if victims like, I don't want to do any of that, I don't want to make a safety plan. I'm not going to report to law enforcement, even just to be able to articulate, which many victims don't, I'm being stalked. Victims are more likely to say something like, my ex is being creepy, or my neighbor's doing too much, or an old friend's made things kind of awkward. But to be able to really say, no, this is stalking. That's a real thing. I can look it up and there are results and resources. Even that can go a long way for our victims. And so, for all those reasons, we want to be naming stalking when it's as a standalone victimization, as well as when it intersects with sexual violence. So, responding to victims, some very big picture things here. One is to recognize that victims cope with stalking and sexual violence, for that matter, differently, right? And all of these are normal human ways to cope, but not some might be more or less effective in dealing with the stalking situation. Some victims' instinct is to move against the stalker. So if saying, oh, you're stalking me, great, you're going to jail, right? They're going to call law enforcement. I'm taking you down. I'm moving against the stalker. They are not getting away with this. You have other victims do the opposite, move inward. I don't want to make it a big thing. I don't want to get anyone in trouble. And of course, we know when our victims know offenders, as they usually do with stalking, just like with sexual violence, sometimes there's that sense of, well, I know them. I don't want to get them in trouble. I don't want to, tell everyone and have the social dynamic get weird. And so those victims tend to just sort of withdraw, move inward, really not speak about what's going on. Some victims move away. That's why you have so many literally relocate. But moving away is anything that creates that distance. So it could be physical distance, like they're changing their routes to and from school or work. Um, they are It could be also they're blocking the person through technology, right? If they stop sharing the location, they blocked them on Snapchat, they shut their Instagram down, they change their phone number, right? So anything that's creating that space, they might move towards the offender to kind of appease them. So that sense of they want to talk every day. Okay, I'll try to call them once a week, and maybe that'll be enough. Or you think about that case where the offender shared intimate images of the victim on the lawn, and then she met up with him to try to kind of negotiate, right, and move towards him. And some move outward, move to folks like you who can help. And that's wonderful. But by the time they've done that, they've probably already tried some of these other things. And so it's good to ask victims what they've already done so you can see what's working, what's not working. Um, and one piece of advice I want to address that our stalking victims often get is this move away advice. And so victims are often told, cease contact, right? Stop. Just don't talk to this person anymore, block them on everything, etc. But let's play that out for a second. Let's say I'm stalking you and I'm old school. I like to call you. Okay. I'm always calling you on the phone. And maybe eventually you're so over it. You're like, I can't with Dana. I'm going to change my freaking number. Right. So eventually I call and I get this number is no longer in service. Am I the stalker going to be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking and become a productive member of society this day? Like, no, I'm already stalking you. I know where you live. I know where you work. I know your friends. I'm going to find another way to you. And I might actually escalate my behavior because how dare you? You took away my favorite way to stalk you. Now, this isn't to say that victims should never use this tactic. In fact, we generally advise no contact and disengagement. And that's because most stalkers see any contact as reinforcement. So if they text 100 times and the victim texts back once, stop it, I hate you. Tomorrow they're texting 101 times because that was a win for that offender. But we also have to realize that that disengagement and that distance is not always realistic or even possible. It might be that contact and negotiation to minimize the threat, right? That keep your enemies closer. And also, if our victim completely blocks the offender, okay, maybe the offender can't see them. They also can't see what the offender's up to. And that's really scary. They're not going to get that text saying, I'm coming over, so they know to leave. They're not going to see on Instagram, oh, they're out of town this weekend. I can relax a little bit, right? A victim put it to me like this once, if when you're being hunted by somebody, don't you want to know where they are? Kind of hard to argue with that. And so it's messier. It's messier from a criminal justice perspective. But it also might be what victims need to do to be safe is to take the temperature, keep their enemies closer, talk that offender down, and or just visually keep track of where they are and their state of mind. And so if there's hard and fast rules or practices in your jurisdiction, like say, no contact order is mutual, protective order will be dropped, make sure your victim knows that. But safety plan around it, have a dialogue around it, and realize that might be a safety strategy. It doesn't mean that that contact was truly mutual, right? We always say document, 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 but we don't always tell victims how, right? And so they might come in with a big diary, it was a sunny day, and you're like, oh no, this is not what we needed, right? And so we have these logs on our website, very succinct, date, time, what happened, where did it happen, the physical location, because there's often jurisdictional issues in our stalking cases. They often involve following someone physically. And so that might cross county lines that victims may not be thinking of, as well as even, state and territory lines where there's a different statute altogether. Also, was it on campus, off campus, what different policies apply? And if technology was used, which platform? Because it's different to get evidence from Apple than from Google, than from Snapchat, than from Meta on Instagram. Like all of those are different. Some are easier than others. We want to capture the scope of harm and also be thinking about, the best ways to get that evidence later. If there's any witnesses, their information, and if there's evidence to encourage our victims to keep it. A lot of times victims don't report for a variety of reasons, but one is that they feel like I can't prove what happened. And for a lot of our victims, if they get, say, a threatening text message, their instinct might be to delete it because it was upsetting and they don't want to think about it every time they look at their phone. But of course, we want to advise our victims to actually save those messages, take those videos, take those screenshots, and make sure that they know best practices for saving that evidence. For example, if it's a text message and we're taking a screenshot, slide your thumb over to show the date and time. These things might seem intuitive to folks who work with the criminal justice system, but they're often not something our victims are thinking about. And if they made a report to anyone, right? If it's an officer, great, let's get their name and badge number. But the reality is it's often hard to know for victims to know who they're reporting to and who's sharing information and who's not. So like, for example, I live in the DC area. And so just driving for 20 minutes, I'll see DC police, Maryland police, Park police, Secret Service. Like it's very hard to know kind of who's who and who's talking and who isn't. And so victims might also say, I told the police, and you talk to them and more, and you're like, oh, you told the bouncer at that club, right? They still told an authority figure. They could be a good witness later, so we want to get that information. But even if they are indeed calling the same law enforcement office every time, they might have a different responding officer. So when they get that call about, oh, someone mailed me this object that's really upsetting to me, they may kind of laugh it off or not really understand what the urgency is. But if you're able to also show this list and say, hey, here's who else I've talked to, here's how long it's been going on, here's everything, it puts that in a different context. This kind of documentation is time consuming for victims. It's not fair that they have to do this, but it is helpful because these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math. And so something like this can help to ensure that. In terms of working with stalking victims, we want to, of course, center safety, physical safety, their health and safety, as well as their mental health and emotional safety. We need to really advocate for these victims. There are very few stalking specific advocates, right? The stalking piece often gets kind of left in the background, even though it is co-occurring with these other victimizations, as well as uniquely traumatic and dangerous. And so because there are few resources, and because our system tends to be incident based, right? We're responding to a call for service. Often nobody's taking a step back and really connecting the dots and saying, how is all of this working together, and really advocating for that victim. And so we need to do that and be raising the alarm on stalking and its urgency. documentation, like I just mentioned, keeping track of all the evidence, every single incident, those that are crimes on their own, like say voyeurism or image distribution, as well as others that may not be criminal on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case, right? Like that sending flowers. If it's a threat, that threat could be a crime too, or part of the case. And of course, offering support. Our system is confusing. It's often really unclear what services are available for victims. And for stalking in particular, again, because there's no stalking crisis center or hotline, victims may not recognize that there's victims compensation or address confidentiality or, any other kind of assistance that they have access to. And if your organization, we know that our rape crisis and domestic violence service organizations serve all victims of stalking, but think about, do victims know that? Because if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged friend, why would I pick up the phone and call the Rape Crisis Center, right? Or the Family Justice Center? But that's where folks like you often are who can help me. And so think about, how are you advertising the work that you do, as well as what significant support do you offer for your stalking victims and survivors? Couple resources, and then I'll open it up to questions. I saw a couple that came in. We have a lot more on our website on these intersections. So the video that you saw earlier, as well as fact sheets, infographics, and more examples of stalking behaviors. So if you're, say, a campus tabling for Sexual Assault Awareness Month, maybe put this in here too. We want to keep stalking on the radar year round. That's why we always offer resources on, for example, domestic violence and stalking, elder abuse and stalking, right? Of course, stalking is Awareness Month is in January, as of course everyone's favorite month. And we do a big campaign then and hope that you'll be part of it. But it's not a one and done. We need this year round to be reinforcing this information. And all of that is at stalkingawareness.org, where we have practitioner guides, training modules for awareness, victim resources like these fact sheets, infographics, brochures, posters, all that good stuff, and webinars. And you can find us on social as well and sign up for our newsletter. Here's my contact information. I just want to thank you so much for your attention and for all of your good work. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, hey, think about this. This could be stalking, ponder that, right? But you're the ones who are actually on the ground, keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It is all easier said than done. And I absolutely understand and respect that. Sexual violence is already a big issue area with plenty of work to do without sort of integrating the stalking piece. And so truly thank you for the work that you do and for taking the time to learn a little bit more about stalking today. And don't hesitate to reach out for more training for your organization, for individual resources, for help with a specific case, etc. And so with that, I'm going to go into the Q&A, and if you have more questions, go ahead and ask them, and we'll see how much we get to. And I'm seeing compliments in the chat as well, which I will also accept. Let's see. Okay, so one is about question from the UK, which it seems like you need to pay us to come do an in-person across the pond, is what I'm hearing. But it said there's amendments to harassment laws in England and Wales, recognize stalking as an individual crime with its own sentencing structure. Is there basically, how is stalking sentenced in the United States? It depends. See, I'm around lawyers too much. It depends. It depends because every state and jurisdiction, not jurisdiction, every state and territory has a different stalking law. So it is a federal crime for stalking that transcends a certain state or territory, but most stalking would be handled by that state. And so they're going to have their own guidelines for what is stalking and how is it sentenced. Sometimes it's a misdemeanor, sometimes it's a felony. Often there are aggravating factors. So, it's a misdemeanor, but if they stalk in violation of a protection order, or they it's a second offense or something like that, now it goes up and gets a higher charge. A lot of our offenders end up under some kind of supervision, which is why our probation folks and our corrections should really be brought in on these trainings and conversations, because so often they're left out of the conversation. Sometimes there's prison time, sometimes there's a monetary fine. So it really depends where you are, what the situation is, and of course the discretion of the court as well. So I hope that helps. Someone asked, have I watched Baby Reindeer? I sure have. What did I think of it? And they've heard some comments about how the victim recognized their responsibility in allowing the stalking to happen, which seemed kind of victim blaming to this person writing in. Yes, I have watched Baby Reindeer. I have a few posts about it on our social as well. I think that, you know, as a standalone piece of media and one man stalking story, this is just my personal opinion. Like, I think it's really powerful. It shows a lot of the complexity of victim offender dynamics. It shows why we don't always have perfect victims, because he does sometimes seek out the offender, right? Or make excuses for her. And that's very human, and that's that's very real to our victims. And I think that it's really nice that it shows that complexity. I agree with you that that doesn't mean that he's responsible for her behavior, right? That made it his fault that she chose to engage in that stalking behavior. And I think in that particular piece of media, again, I think it's really well done. My concern is the conversation around it, because there's been a lot of blanket statements made about, like, well, this shows you that stalking is a mental health issue, full stop. This shows you that victims don't do the right things, full stop, right? And no, it is, this is one specific case, right? That's highlighting some dynamics, but it is not representative of most or all stalking cases and how they work. And so I do think that it's helpful to acknowledge the complexity of victim and offender dynamics, that we do have victims that reach out to offenders, that don't block offenders, that reconcile with offenders, right? And that's something that for folks who don't know more about power and control dynamics can be really puzzling and make them just kind of throw their hands up and say, well, I guess they're not a real victim, and that's not true. And so I think highlighting the very human element of that actually can be really helpful. And I think we need to contextualize it in terms of who is responsible for the behavior, and that's certainly the offender and not the victim. So I hope that that kind of answers your question. I'm always happy to talk Baby Reindeer. But like I said, we have some posts about it as well on our social. And one more question here. I've had victims believe their offenders are texting from a specific program where they contact from different numbers. Is there a way to know if it's coming from the offender? So what it sounds like spoofing to me, and we do training on the use of technology to stalk as well. It sounds like that might be something that you're interested in. There's a few there's a few different strategies for that. If you have a specific suspect and they're using, say, a spoofing platform to send a text message, right? So I'm going to pretend to be your mom. It's going to say it's coming from your mom, but it's actually coming from me. If you have a suspect and you have access to their devices, which I know are some pretty big ifs, right? Then you can see, have they paid a spoofing service? Have they gone through a spoofing website? Have they, if it's a phone call or voicemail, do they have a history of calling that service? And, you know, to try to kind of unpack that. And also, if they were impersonating, say, mom, okay, look at mom's outgoing text messages. She's not going to have any because she didn't text you. You look at the offenders, they have an outgoing message to a spoofing app at that time. It doesn't add up, right? So in that example, you need all three devices. I know a little bit more about calls than texting. And so often it is that contextual information. Are they using that nickname? Is it for the victim? Are they doing this again and again? it can be hard to prove who is behind not impossible, but difficult to prove who's behind it. But often victims know if their instinct is that it is the offender, they're probably right. So all that to say, there are strategies. You can subpoena the top few big spoofing companies, for example, but definitely reach out for more tech training. And it depends what kind of service that they're using. But yes, that's very common. It's unfortunately very easy to do and very frustrating. And I think just explaining what's going on, that this person is not some kind of tech genius. They just spent $10 on a dumb website or app, and now they're texting or calling, making it look like it's coming from someone else. That doesn't fix the whole problem, but as a victim, I'd certainly want to know that, just to know what's going on. And let's see, I got one more question here in the chat that I'm seeing. And please do put them in the Q&A just so I don't miss any. And that's, what about, the percentage of offenders in terms of men and women? So overwhelmingly, our victims report the offender's male. That's true over 80% of the time for our female victims, the offender's male. It's also true about half the time for our male victims, for half the time their offender's male. And so there absolutely are, anyone can be a stalker or a victim. There absolutely are women that stalk men. That certainly happens, but the vast majority are men stalking women, and then another category of men stalking other men. Sometimes that's an extension of power and control from a same-sex relationship, and sometimes it's what we call target dispersion. So you have, say, an ex-husband stalking an ex-wife. She gets a new boyfriend. Okay, so now the ex-husband stalking the new boyfriend as well. That's not all men stalking other men, but that is a big piece of it. And so, yeah, mostly men, mostly stalking women, but certainly plenty of exceptions to that. And we also know stalking's underreported, right? We know it's underreported for everyone, and there's additional barriers to men reporting and seeking help. Particularly when it's a female stalker who might be perceived as less threatening or be taken less seriously. We certainly saw that since someone brought up baby reindeer, right? That doesn't fit the typical fear dynamic. And so it was embarrassing for that victim to be coming forward and admitting his fear. And so, yeah, so all that to say, that certainly happens, and that's the breakdown as far as we know it in terms of offenders. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I always talk forever, so I will very uncharacteristically actually end early. Um, but please do reach out for further training with any other questions for a certificate of attendance, etc. Appreciate y'all sticking around. Have a wonderful rest of your Sexual Assault Awareness Month and beyond. And I hope that you'll connect with us on social media and our newsletter to keep track of all of our new resources. I'll also be presenting on the health impacts of stalking in partnership with the International Association of Forensic Nurses on May 1st. And so that'll be great. So definitely register for that one on our website as well. So thank you all for joining. Thanks to Kendra and Shannon, and keep in touch.